Good morning and greetings in Jesus' name this morning. This morning I would like to continue with looking at the book of Titus, so you can turn to that book. And last 2 weeks ago, we looked at Titus 1, verses 1 through 9, and I think Russ must know me fairly good because he said he leaned over to one of his sons and said, I think I had said something about 3 sermons, and he said he can see 4 sermons coming up here. And as I started studying for this one, maybe there'll be 5. I'm not sure. So that was accurate, because I was thinking on this sermon I would get through into chapter 2, and I ended up getting kind of stuck here on verses 10 through 16, dealing with false teachers. So that's what I'd like to look at this morning. I think it's a very relevant subject for our day, and worth spending some time thinking about false teachers as they were present here in Paul's time, in Titus's time, and also in our own day as well. So last time verses 1 to 9 was the introduction, Paul's greeting to Titus, and then the qualifications for elders and bishops, for overseers. And so we looked at that last time, what a qualifications are for a leader of the church, and what Titus was supposed to be looking for there. And then in verses 10 through 16, you kind of have the contrast here of what the good things were that the qualifications were for the elders, and then what was needed to deal with these false teachers, and the way they acted was kind of exactly opposite of the good characteristics that were needed for a good leader here, both now and then. So one of the terms we see repeated in Titus is sound doctrine. It talks about that quite a bit, and other places in Paul's teaching he does too, but sound doctrine or sound teaching. And that's one of the themes you see in this book, is the importance of sound doctrine in the church. And that's very necessary, especially as we're thinking specifically about dealing with false teachers or errors that people are bringing, and that need to be rebuked, as it talks about here. Though they claim to know God, their minds and their consciences are defiled, it says. And so the only way to know what that error is if we have sound doctrine, and we have that in our own lives, and also that it's being taught across in the teaching that comes from the church. We may often think of the main threats to the church being from the outside, and I think there is many of those threats. People like, the obvious threats like atheists, agnostics, very liberal, woke people, that kind of thing, that we think, well, they're the ones that are coming, to take the church. But the Bible is much more on the side that the real threat comes from within. The inside is where the real danger is to the church. And there are people who profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. That's what it says in verse 16 there. And that same idea is given in chapter 3 as well, verse 2, where it talks about those who have an appearance of godliness but deny the power of it, deny its power. And so after Paul describes here the characteristics for elders and overseers, he describes these other leaders who are doing the opposite of what good leaders should be doing, and who are leading people astray. And that's the subject for this morning, is identifying false teachers. So let's read verses 10 through 16 of chapter 1, Titus chapter 1. For there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. This witness is true, wherefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men that turn from the truth. Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure. But even their mind and conscience is defiled. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work reprobate. So, reading those verses, they're very strongly worded verses. What Paul is requiring of Titus here is he's not mincing any words about what he should do with these false teachers and the danger that they present to the church. He spends some time here explaining who these people are, and again, what this impact that they can have on this church. And he doesn't give any names here, and it's possible that Paul didn't even know the names of the people involved here, being not present at this church. But he knew how to explain the characteristics of what these people were doing and who they were. And it seems like it was a mixture of people here, but the largest group was of Jewish background. There's questions of what type of Jewish background they had. They almost seems like they were separate from the Judaizers, more just false teachers who were of Jewish background and were using some of the Judaizing thing that they needed to keep the Old Testament law as part of the heresy that they were teaching here. But the characters that we want to look at, and the three that I think you see spelled out here, are rebellion. They were disobedient to God's word and to those who teach it. They were empty talkers. Their teachings and their opinions had no true spiritual value and produced no spiritual fruit. And that's what Paul was pointing out here. And they were deceivers. They were not simply mistaken or uninformed, but they were intending to lead people astray. They were promoting something that they knew to be false. And that was the characteristics: rebellious, disobedient, empty talkers, and deceivers. And so in verse 12, it talks there about one of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and slow bellies. And it's probably easier sometimes to hear critique of your own family or culture if it's coming from somebody inside. And so if I say we as Mennonites tend to be stingy, it's different probably than if somebody from outside the Mennonite group says Mennonites are always stingy. When I say it from among us, we say, well, yeah, that's true, and we recognize that. But then when somebody says it from outside the group, then it feels like criticism, which there's an element of truth. Probably Mennonites are stingy and should work on that. But I think this is a little bit why Paul was quoting the poet here. It was Epimenides, I think was his name, or the prophet here, this Cretan prophet, because he wanted to use words from within them to say, you have some negative characteristics here. And he was also using a stereotype here as well, because he was saying they are always liars. And so obviously you know that nobody is always something or always not something. And so he was definitely using a type of a stereotype when he said always. And it's a little like saying that all New Yorkers are loud and rude and eat their pizza folded in half. Some of them do, and of course that's wrong, but that is just the way they act, a lot of them. But not all New Yorkers do that. And so I think by Paul quoting this saying about the Cretans, he's saying that these false teachers are fitting the stereotype. And that's the problem here, is that while the stereotype does not apply to everybody, there's a lot of these Cretans that have these issues, and unfortunately what these teachers are fitting the negative stereotype when they should be the very opposite. They should be living outside of this and be examples of good doctrine and sound teaching instead of the worst stereotypes that people expect of them. And so that's a little bit how he's describing the Cretans here, but especially those who are the false teachers. And again, some of these characteristics of false teachers, they're unruly and resist authority. Verse 10 there it talks, for there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers. And so he says that there are many among you that are insubordinate. And it's obvious that this was not just one or two people, but it was a larger group here that were involved in this false teaching. And the group was in rebellion to the sound doctrine that Paul had proclaimed, and that he was telling Titus to proclaim as well and uphold in his own life and in the life of the early Christians here. And one of the signs of a false teacher is their unwillingness to be under authority. And I think that when you see false teachers, that's a kind of a red flag, is that if they do not want to be under the authority of a church or under the authority of a governing board and want to be able to run the thing themselves, that's often a sign that there may be questions about why they don't want to resist this authority. And that was one of the characteristics here that Paul brought up, was that if they're unruly and disobedient, it was a sign of a false teacher. And so if men and women or women are resistant to being a church member, having an organization with a governing body, I think that's a big red flag that there may be something wrong with the way they're going about things. There's also this thing of esoteric teaching instead of sound doctrine. He says, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men that turn from the truth in verse 14 there. And this was another characteristics of these teachers, was that they often focused on one little thing and then made it into a much bigger thing, kind of made it their point of distinction and took it way out of proportion. In 1 Timothy 1:6, Paul said, some have deviated from these sound doctrines and turned aside to fruitless discussions. They want to be teachers of the law, although they don't understand what they are saying or what they are insisting on, from the Holman translation. And the King James Version says they have turned to vain jangling, which I think is not really a word we use, but kind of an interesting way to describe these teachers, that they have turned to vain jangling. Their words, even though it sounds like they are saying something important, what they're saying does not line up with doctrine, and it often is empty in the end. And I don't know if you know people who are enamored by these little issues that they get sidetracked on, and they blow them up into big issues and then divide themselves, churches or themselves from churches and things like that, because they have this unique understanding that goes against what the Bible teaches and what, the tradition is. And again, just because it's tradition doesn't always mean it's right, but when something has been there for has a long history going behind it, you always need to be cautious about coming up with your own understanding of it. And there's people like that will take things like holidays, versions of the Bible, eschatology, all these things that you can't say they are 100% right or wrong, and they'll build kind of a whole case that, this is the only right way to do it, and that is often causes division, and in the end leads people away from the truth. And so this theme of endless genealogies and Jewish fable and empty talk, it seems to be a theme here that the church at this time was facing, because I think that was probably something that was popular at the time. Maybe today these exact things aren't exactly what we're facing, but there's always something that in our time is the things that we're facing, the current issues. And there are individuals here who wanted to deviate from the main teachings and kind of the plain things and get off on these peculiar teachings. And I think the word esoteric is a good way to describe their teaching. It means very unusual and understood or liked by only a small number of people, especially those with special knowledge. And I think that's a good way to describe these type of points that these teachers were making, is they were very specialized, unusual, and only understood by a small group of people. I had listened to a book called Cultish about how cults use specialized language, almost like religious terminology, to kind of divide people and make sure that only the people in the cult group, whatever that is, understand the language. And they said language is one of the most important ways that people are drawn into cults. And when they learn the language or their terminology of the cult, then they often feel like they're an insider or that they have special knowledge that other people don't have. Just to give an instance of this, in this book, she talks a little bit in ways that people from certain cults, and Scientology is one of these, and she just has a brief paragraph here of somebody talking to somebody else, saying, ever since I went clear last year, my whole outlook has shifted. I've been auditing regularly with my twin, and we're making real progress up the bridge. I even started my OT levels, talk about confronting the reactive mind. It's intensive, but I can feel my theta improving every day. Now, to somebody who doesn't understand Scientology, half of those words don't even make sense. So when you would hear these people talking, you wouldn't even know what they're talking about. But they all, to a Scientologist, they mean things, whatever that is. And I'm not going to go into explaining what that is. There's even multi-level marketing often follows this kind of thing too, where they have special terminology, different levels and things like that they talk about, and always have the same type of behavior or talking conversations when they talk to each other. And this language is sort of supposed to sound like it's maybe empowering or something, but it often is not really that. It's just a way to separate them from other people and to make people feel like they are involved in something that is important when it really often is not that. And it's often actually the very opposite of something important and something that's leading them astray. And truth never needs to be obscured by jargon and complicated terms. It is simple, and the plain things should be simple. They shouldn't be hard to understand. And the goal of teaching sound doctrine is to make things clear and easy to understand, to make the plain things plain, not to make things more complicated and to find little areas of specialty where we can, maybe put our own understanding on things and things like that. It's to make the gospel and sound doctrine plain and something that everybody can understand. And again, that's what was happening here in the early church. It seemed like these false teachers were just focusing on small issues that were not important and dividing people. And that was one of the big things you see here. It says they subvert whole houses because of their teachings. Verse 11, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. And these teachers, it seemed like they first overtook families with their false teachings, and then used that as a base to go into the larger congregation. And that's a familiar pattern with false teachers, is they'll often try to get into a larger group, kind of like wolves preying on weaker, straggling members of a herd. They will prey on the vulnerable. And so whether that's somebody that's ignorant, who is not grounded in sound doctrine and who is ignorant because of that, or inexperienced, often they will prey on the youth because they're not as experienced. And again, it's not like youth can't be full of sound doctrine either, but without as much experience, they're often more vulnerable. And so instead of being a support to the church and the church leaders, they subvert and try to pull people away from that. And so their goal, again, is not to build up their own the kingdom of God, but it's often building up their own kingdom instead. And they often pull people away and create a group, and then often in the end that group will fall apart as well, and in the end it's people have been drawn away and left stranded and often outside of the faith at that point. Their motivation, it says, is for filthy lucre's sake, for money or for wealth. In verse 11 there it says they teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. And again, these were, it seems like, false teachers who were in it for the money. Somehow they were trying to find an angle where they could probably raise offerings or funds by getting people on their side and then somehow use this to create wealth for themselves. And some false teachers, I think, are deceived. That they actually truly do believe that what they're teaching is the truth. But it seemed like these teachers here were they were in it to deceive people, and they full well knew that they were in it for that. And it seemed like their main motive was money here. They wanted to create wealth and privilege for themselves through this false teaching. And these kind of false teachers are often easier to spot than those who maybe really truly believe in what they're teaching. They often have very flamboyant lifestyles, and they ask for money a lot and those kind of things. And it seems like we should this is very obvious this person is in it for the wrong motives. But unfortunately, it still seems like that draws a certain amount of people to them when they have that kind of lifestyle, that people will still follow them and are drawn to that, maybe because they want that for themselves. And so they kind of look at this, especially the health and wealth preachers, as something, maybe that's what I could get if I truly follow this enough. I could also become wealthy. And so there is a certain amount of appeal there. But again, that is not what sound doctrine is about, is getting rich and making a lot of money. And so Paul is challenging Titus here against these false teachers that are just that's their motivation, is money. And then we have the damage here, and Titus was told to silence, that sort of has the word of gag, like put something over their mouths, because this was not simply a difference of opinion on a religious topic of some kind, but this teaching that they were giving was going to compromise the faith and salvation of these whole families. And if they kept going on, the whole church, it could spread to that. And so the elders that he appointed here should have knowledge. He said that they need to have the knowledge and the sound doctrine to be able to refute this teaching when they see it. And they needed to have the confidence to block these types of people that were speaking this out from speaking in the congregation, and they were to do it without fear. And again, the way that he describes what the leaders are to do and the actions they're supposed to take sound pretty strong, telling them to, there are many unruly and vain talkers whose mouths must be stopped. And also it says there in verse 16 that they profess to know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient unto every good work, reprobate. Again, very strong words to describe them. And so, again, he's saying that these people are very dangerous for the church, and the church leadership and those in the church need to be able to stop this from happening. He's basically saying that the false teachers in verse 16 there, they profess that they know God, and talks about how they deny him and are disobedient and unto every good work reprobate. They boast about their spiritual maturity, but yet their deeds deny their boasts, and the fruit that they produce is only division and loss of faith. And so again, this is a very serious problem here that these false teachers are bringing into the church. The false teachers are a little like signs that you see, and you might pass. There's one restaurant along 322 that always says the best cheesesteak in Lancaster County. And you might know, if you pass there enough, you might know which one that is. Or sometimes people will say that, there's the best chicken sandwich in the world. And who is the judge of that? Who has said that this one restaurant has the best cheesesteak in Lancaster County, which I've had them, and I don't think I would agree with that. Not to put down that restaurant, they're good otherwise. But, to say that they are the best one in the county or the best chicken sandwich in the world, who really is the judge of that? Well, most of the time, these are self-proclaimed, talking about themselves and just self-proclaiming, and that's exactly what these false teachers were doing too, is that they didn't really have anything to back up what they were teaching or their credentials, but they were self-proclaiming that I'm such and such. They were boasting about how great they were, and that was really the only thing that they had to prove was their own words. And for the sad thing is that for a number of these Christians here, apparently in this church, that was all they needed, and they were drawn after these people. And they couldn't have flourished unless they had an audience. And that's what was happening here, is unfortunately it seems like a lot of these early Christians were providing a listening ear to these false teachers. And if a church is not well-versed in the truth, in the sound doctrine that Paul keeps bringing up here, they are going to be prey for these types of false teachers. And Paul says in Ephesians, when he said to the Ephesians when he was leaving Ephesus, I think for the final time, he said there, for I know that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. And those words were very prophetic, and they were coming true here in the church at Crete as well, that these wolves were entering in, and it says men arising, speaking perverse things. And James 2:18, where it says, you have faith and I have works, show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Basically, show me actions to prove up what you're talking. And that's what Paul is kind of echoing here, is that same theme, is that your actions need to back up your words, not the other way. You can't just be empty talkers. And that's what he's challenging them here, is to judge these men by the works and the way that they live out their lives. Their deeds denied God because they didn't produce what God wanted, which was a growing faith in loving deeds, the fruit that would grow out of this. They were producing exactly the opposite. They were sowing loss and confusion in faith, and there was no absence of good deeds that Paul wanted to see here, like he talked about in what he wanted to see in the elders, and then in chapter 2, what he wanted to see in a Christian family as well. They were producing the opposite of good fruit. Instead, what they were producing was endless debate, division, and loss of faith. Now, verse 15 that can be kind of a difficult verse there. Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure, but even their mind and conscience is defiled. And people have often taken this verse out of context. To the pure all things are pure, and have used it to excuse all sorts of sin. A pastor I was reading, he said he was warning a teenager about some kind of literature that he was reading, and the teenager said, well, his defense was, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and your heart must be filthy if you see sin in what I'm reading. And so people will often turn that and say, well, to me this is pure. Just because you see something bad in it, that must mean that you're actually the one with the problem. And maybe there's an element of truth to that, but often it's used as a way to kind of divert blame from something that may be a problem in their own lives that is being pointed out. Because he said, after all, to the pure, all things are pure. And so people have used this to justify sin. And the thing to keep in mind about this verse is that Paul here is referring to Jewish dietary restrictions. That's specifically what he's talking about here. And this is, again, one of the things that the Judaizers were telling the people they needed to follow the Jewish dietary laws, the kosher thing, and follow that to be a Christian. And Paul was, as he had said, the Gentiles did not need to follow that as believers in Christ. But again, that's specifically what this verse is talking about, and I think it can also be taken in a larger context as well. But basically, he was saying that they were saying if you ate forbidden food, you defiled yourself, but if you refused the food, you became holier. And so by avoiding the food that was restricted, you became holier. And Paul said it's actually the opposite. These teachers have defiled minds and consciences, and he said, therefore, when they look at the innocent food, they see sin, because sin has defiled their vision. But those of us who have pure minds and consciences know that all food is clean. And so a Christian who is no longer needs to follow these because all things are pure to them. But again, these teachers were trying to say that these things were defiled, and therefore it says to them, even their mind and conscience is defiled. And so it's kind of a complicated verse, but the principle should not be applied regardless what is the meaning of this. It should never be applied to something that we know is evil and say because, and used to justify that. Now, another thing with this verse is that we have to also be aware that the principles of legalism or self-righteousness, that also can apply to this as well, where people that legalists often will see things that are evil and things that are not. I think modesty is one of these areas where it can be taken out of context or taken to an extreme where people will say that because, a woman's body or any kind of beauty is evil, therefore you have to have extreme rules about modesty because the man's heart is evil. And I think there is a certain level of that where a woman's beauty is turned into something evil or twisted, and that is because certain men maybe can only see temptation in the beauty, and then they apply these extreme rules on modesty, which I think you see that in Muslim culture where they make the women completely cover every inch of their body with these like burqas and things like that. And I think that's really pointing back to a problem that's not resolved with the men. And so again, there's a balance here where something that should be pure can be taken to extremes and turned into something evil because of evil in the person's heart. And so this is what was happening with these false teachers, again, is that they were making things that were not sin and that could be pure into something that was evil, with dietary restrictions specifically. And so we have in the end here, what was Paul to do? What was Titus to do? And Paul's words here are pretty strong. Their mouths must be stopped and they must be rebuked sharply. Again, not that he's really treading lightly around this subject. In 2 Timothy 4:2, Paul told Timothy, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. And again, just emphasizing that same thought. And I know there's churches where people have been excommunicated or forbidden to become members due to unrepentance or ongoing sin in their lives, and yet they continue to come to church every Sunday and speak in the service and things like that. And we don't want to hurt people's feelings or be unkind and things like that, which is good. But I have to wonder what Paul would say about that. It seems like he didn't mince words about this, and he said he felt like for these people to be turned back, they needed to have a sharp rebuke, and that they needed to be silenced because of the problem in their own lives, and then also the problem that they were pulling people away from the faith as well. And I think sometimes a sharp rebuke is a much kinder thing to the person if it brings them back into the faith than nicely letting a person lead a life that eventually ends in death and them going to hell. And so Paul uses very strong language here telling Titus what he needs to do to stop these voices from coming into the churches here. Jesus said in Matthew 7:15, these false teachers will come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. And in closing here, I'd just like to think a little bit more about false teachers, the wolves. And wolves often look like sheep. They don't look like sheep, but they often will come dressed like them so that they're hard to spot. And to spot a wolf, the only thing that we can really do is know the values and qualities that we need to know what sound doctrine is so that we can know what is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And again, in Jesus' day, there was a lot of legalism that the Pharisees and scribes and people like that, they really prized this looking good on the outside. And so the wolves often looked like legalists. And then a little later on in church history, you had this, then it was creeping in already here in these verses, this secret knowledge thing, these little esoteric things that these wolves often latched on and tried to say these are the important things when they were really just little issues that were not worthy of being made into such big issues. And they call those kind of generally the Gnostics. And today in America, there's many different things, many different influences out there, and so it's not very surprising that we see a lot of different false teachers. Health and wealth gospel is one, and so today we value health and wealth a lot, and so it's no surprise that there's a lot of teachers that are promoting this prosperity gospel. And there's also a lot of call for social change and things like that, and so there's different false teachers that really get on the social change thing and really promote that as almost being more important, or really what religion is about is not so much your relationship with God, but changing society for the better. There's different things like that. But there was an article I read that he said, I thought was very well worded, or a very good thought. He talked about another type of wolf that often, he said, goes unnoticed, a type that we might call the broken wolf. And I thought this is probably applicable often in some of our churches. There's this tendency for these people to be around. He described these broken wolves as false teachers who use their own authenticity, pain, and brokenness to attract believers who are also suffering and broken, and then using their brokenness to lead sheep to turn away from God's word and embrace sin. Now, I'm not sure that you can always say that they're telling them to embrace sin, but they often will blend into a flock because they're people that have been hurt. Maybe they experienced abuse of some kind, things like that. And as Christians, we're supposed to be open to people that are hurting. And so maybe our guard is down when we see vulnerable or hurting people, as it probably should be. We see these people as people that we want to help, or that may be needing help. And often this, if you have followed victim advocate groups, it seems like there's a lot of this around that group of people. And the thing is, they're dealing with a very serious and real problem of abuse, sexual abuse, but often they come with teachings that they're also promoting that are beyond the problem that they're dealing with. And so that's, I think, a good way to describe this is these broken wolves. It said, I think quoting from here, the article, he said, "But what separates broken wolves from broken sheep is the former, the wolves, believe their brokenness provides them, like the Gnostics of a previous era, with secret knowledge such as fresh insights into the human condition. Because they can see more clearly than those who are whole," or as they would describe them, the average hypocritical churchgoer, "they reinterpret Scripture, discarding the musty old understandings of previous generations of Christians for interpretations that just so happen to align with their preferences for a change in the church," or something like that. And I think that is something to be very aware of, is that there's a tendency and there's groups of people out there that are following that exact model. Again, what they're dealing with, sexual abuse, is very real, and it's something that does need to be dealt with, but often paired with that is other teachings that are subtly influencing people away from sound doctrine and from the church. And so again, it's the people that are the most subtle that are the ones that are hard to find. It's not hard to spot the health and wealth gospel who's slaying people in the spirit and wearing gold rings on his fingers and things like that. It's these kind of people that are just subtly diverting from the truth. And so, again, it's something to be aware of. 3 ways to identify wolves, I think, there's 3 signs that I think we often see. The organization will not participate or accept accountability, especially the accountability framework of the churches that is attempting to influence and work among. And so if you have a person or a group of people that are influencing, say, our church, but yet they will not come under the same accountability, there's some questions there that should be raised. When they claim to be part of the community of churches, again, whose accountability framework they reject. And so they say, well, yes, we're a part of this group, but yet they don't abide by that, and they only use the we as a way to pull people in. Again, there's questions about that. Who are they truly looking out for? And there's a common thread to need to diminish the authority of the church by conveying the idea that Jesus in some way frees humans from the church. And I think when you see that teaching as well, that, well, the church is the problem, you need to get out of that, and you need to do things the way I say or the way you as an individual feel, that is also a problem, and again, is not teaching sound doctrine, because, again, the New Testament is very clear that the church body is how we grow as believers, not from separating ourselves from it. Again, the answer, it all comes back. The answer to detecting wolves among the sheep is knowing sound doctrine. That's what Paul keeps highlighting here in these verses, and you see it throughout the New Testament. And that's why it's so important for the leaders that we're going to be selected here to be people who knew sound doctrine and who studied the Word and knew false teaching from right teaching. And that was why, again, Paul was so concerned and spent time going over this in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus about who these leaders are that they're electing and who he's supposed to look for, that they needed to be grounded in sound doctrine. And he was convinced that those who truly knew and believed the truth would live it out in their personal lives, and that's how you would actually see it. You would see fruits in their personal lives and in their families that would show that they were truly following sound doctrine, and that's how you would see it. And so I think we'll close at this time, but the next chapter is chapter 2, where we look at Christian doctrine and conduct, especially in the family, or how the family structure was set up. And I think there was a lot of unbelievers here in Crete who had never seen Christians before. And so it was a new community, and the people here were all probably watching this new group of Christians to see how they acted. They knew that they acted strange. They didn't go to the sacrifices for the gods. They no longer went to the drunken parties that they used to go to. And like somebody said, they're even rumored that they refused to take the oath of allegiance to the emperor. And so people were watching this church and wondering, who are these people and how are they acting and what do they believe? Are they some secret, society that holds secret parties when nobody's watching, or what do they do? And what does Paul look at here when he teaches Titus? He says, well, what we need to do is make sure that the way our families look is what the people that are watching or what they're observing have something that they can look at and see what a true Christian looks like. And so what did the families look like? That's the thing we want to look at in chapter 2 there. He goes through the whole list, just giving a little introduction. The older people, the youth, and slaves, all the different structures of the family and even their society at the time, how they would act as Christians. And so, again, this is what the non-believing Cretes might be wondering about and watching for. How are these people going to act? And Paul here is teaching Titus what it should look like for a group of Christians looking completely different than the way the other creeds look like and how they live out their lives. And so, again, that's, I think, where we'll close this morning. The verse in chapter 2, verse 1, again, it says, "But speak thou the things which become sound doctrine." Again, reinforcing that idea that sound doctrine, knowing the Bible, knowing the truth, is what will separate from false teachers and also separate how we organize and run our families and even our whole lives as well. So at this time, why don't we kneel for a word of prayer?